I want to be clear about something before I get into this. I am not a person who scares easily, and I'm not someone who talks about things I cannot explain. I spent 31 years as a county sheriff's deputy in Otsego County, Michigan, and in that time, I saw enough of the worst that people do to each other that I stopped being surprised by most things a long time ago. But what happened in the winter of 2010, in the months between January and late March, is something I have never fully made peace with. I have talked around it at retirement dinners and deflected questions from younger officers who heard rumors. I have never sat down and said the whole thing out loud until now. I'm 63 years old, and my wife passed 2 years ago, and there's nobody left in my life who would think less of me for telling it. So here it is. It started with the livestock. That is always how it starts in rural areas when something goes wrong in the woods. A farmer named Delbert House, who ran a small operation off a 2-track about 7 miles northeast of Gaylord, called the non-emergency line in the first week of January to report that something had gotten into his goat pen overnight. He had lost 4 animals, not taken, not dragged away in the usual sense. They were still in the pen, or most of them were. The way he described the scene to the dispatcher, and the way I saw it myself when I drove out the following morning, was something I have spent years trying to categorize and never managed to. The fence was intact. The gate was latched. Whatever had done this had come over the top of a 6-foot enclosure, done what it did, and left the same way. The ground outside was frozen hard and crusted with snow, and there were impressions in that snow that the responding deputy had already photographed before I arrived. Large impressions, the kind of spread and depth that made you look twice, and then look again, and then stop saying anything out loud about what you were thinking. I told Delbert it was probably a large dog or a pair of dogs working together. I told him to reinforce the top of the enclosure and call us again if it happened. He looked at me the way a man who has farmed the same land for 40 years looks at someone who does not know what they are talking about. He did not argue. He just nodded and walked back toward his house, and I noticed he did not look toward the tree line at the edge of his property when he walked. He kept his eyes forward, deliberately. I thought about that later. I thought about it a lot. By mid-January, we had 6 similar reports spread across a roughly 12-mile corridor running from southeast of Vanderbilt up toward the edge of the Pigeon River Country State Forest. Livestock losses, mostly goats and sheep, 1 pen of rabbits completely cleared out, and in one case, a farmer's dog that had been chained to a stake in the yard found dead at the end of its chain. That last one bothered the responding officer more than she initially let on. She mentioned it to me in passing, said the dog had not been mauled in any recognizable pattern, said it looked like whatever had done it had not been feeding, had just stopped. She used the word deliberate and then immediately said she did not mean it that way and changed the subject. We put it in our incident logs under animal predation, unknown species, and I sent a query to the Department of Natural Resources asking whether there had been any unusual wolf activity reported in Otsego or Cheboygan County that season. The response came back 10 days later, indicating no unusual pack movements had been documented. Standard language. The kind of response you get when the people answering your questions have their own categories, and your incident does not fit neatly into any of them. The first time a person actually saw something was the last week of January. A woman named Carol Benning, who was in her late 50s at the time and had lived on her property outside of Johannesburg for over 20 years, called dispatch at 4:40 in the morning. She was calm on the phone, which is what the dispatcher noted afterward. Calm in that specific way that people get when they have already moved past the part where panic is useful. She said there was something standing at the edge of her backyard near the wood line. She said it had been there for approximately 15 minutes. She said it was standing upright. I took that call myself and was at her property within 20 minutes. She met me at the door with her coat already on, a flashlight in one hand and her late husband's rifle in the other. She was steady. I want to say that clearly because it matters. Carol Benning was not a woman given to imagination or dramatics. She had outlasted a bad marriage, raised 3 kids on that land largely alone, and spent her winters in a house that was 3 miles from its nearest neighbor. She was the kind of person who fixes what breaks and moves on. She walked me around the side of the house to the back porch and pointed toward the wood line, maybe 80 feet out. There was nothing there by then, but there were tracks, and the ground in her backyard had enough packed snow from a freeze 2 days earlier to hold an impression cleanly. I crouched down with my flashlight and studied what was in front of me for a long moment. The stride length between impressions was something I measured with the tape I kept in my coat pocket. Just under 5 feet from one to the next, the depth and spread of each impression was unlike anything I had a ready explanation for. The shape at the toe end showed distinct elongation and what looked like claw drag. But the overall form was wrong for any canine I had experience with, and I had hunted since I was 14 years old. I photographed everything and said very little. Carol told me that she had woken up at around 4 in the morning for no reason she could name. That had been happening to her more often that winter, she said. That sense of being pulled out of sleep by something you cannot identify. She had gone to the kitchen for water and looked out the window over the sink out of habit and seen the shape at the tree line. She said it was tall. She said it was standing completely still, and that was what unsettled her more than its size, not moving at all, just oriented toward the house. She could not make out detail in the dark, but she said it was on 2 legs and it was not a person. She said she knew that the moment she saw it, and she did not try to explain how she knew. I asked her how long she stood at the window before calling us. She said about 3 minutes. I asked her if it moved during that time. She said it turned its head once. Slowly, she said, like it was checking the yard in both directions, methodical, like it was accounting for everything it could see before deciding something. I wrote that down in my official notebook, and then I wrote it again that night in the other one. I drove the perimeter roads in that area until sunrise and saw nothing. I wrote my report. I did not include Carol's description of the creature's behavior in the official language. I noted tracks of undetermined origin and recommended a follow-up wildlife consultation. Nobody followed up. That was not unusual. We were a small department, and January in northern Michigan does not slow down for anything that cannot be definitively categorized. By the second week of February, I had started keeping a separate notebook, a small spiral one that I kept in the inside pocket of my duty coat rather than in the glove box with the department-issued one. I told myself it was just a way of organizing information that did not fit the standard report format. I knew even then that was not entirely true. What I was really doing was building a private record of something I did not yet have language for. 14 incidents documented in official channels over 6 weeks. Another 9 that I knew about informally, passed to me by a DNR contact named Russell Fitch, who had been working the Pigeon River corridor for 20 years and who called me one evening in early February and spoke quietly for about 20 minutes and then said he would deny the conversation if I ever repeated it. Russell had been finding sign in the state forest that he said did not correspond to anything in his experience or his training. Not wolf, not bear, not any combination of known predators working the same territory. The kills he had located were efficient in a way that bothered him. Clean kills, mostly deer, with the carcasses left partially consumed and then returned to later, which was consistent with caching behavior in some predators. But the positioning of those carcasses when he found them on return visits suggested they had been moved, deliberately relocated, sometimes a quarter mile or more from where he had first documented them. He could not explain that. He said he had shared his concern with his supervisor and been told to document and monitor. He said his supervisor had not seemed surprised, which itself surprised him. The incident that changed everything for me happened on the night of February 19th. I was running a late patrol on a stretch of county road that borders the forest on its western edge, a road that locals call the back cutoff because it saves about 8 miles between 2 townships if you know where to turn. It was 11:30 at night and the temperature was somewhere around 4 degrees Fahrenheit, and the road was glazed with a thin sheet of ice that had formed after a brief thaw earlier in the day. I was driving slowly, maybe 20 miles an hour, watching the shoulders. It was the kind of night where your headlights seem to stop about 20 feet out, and everything beyond that is just dark. I saw the first one on the left side of the road, standing in the shallow ditch at the tree line. My headlights caught it for maybe 3 seconds as I came around a long curve. My first instinct, the instinct that came before thought, was that it was a person. The upright posture, the height, something about the way it was oriented, facing the road rather than the forest, suggested awareness of my approach. Then I registered the proportions, and my foot came off the accelerator without me deciding to do that. It was too tall. The shoulders were wrong. The head was wrong, set too far forward on the neck, shaped in a way that my brain processed and then refused to process for a moment, the way your eyes sometimes skip over something that does not belong in a scene before dragging themselves back to it. I came to a full stop about 40 feet past where it was standing and sat there with my hands on the wheel and the engine running. I looked in my side mirror. I could see the shape still at the tree line in the red wash of my brake lights. It had not moved. I want to tell you that I got out of the vehicle. I want to tell you that my training and my 31 years of experience overrode whatever was moving through me in that moment. But I sat in that car for what I later estimated was about 4 minutes, and I did not get out. What I did was reach for my radio and then stop, because I did not know what I would say. I did not have words yet for what I was looking at. I turned on my spotlight and swung it toward the tree line. The shape was gone, not moving away, not stepping back into the brush, just gone between 1 second and the next, as if the light itself had erased it. I sat there for another few minutes, and then I drove to the end of the road and turned around and came back slowly with my spotlight running along both shoulders the whole way. I found nothing. I wrote in my personal notebook when I got back to the station. I did not write anything in the official one. What I did not know that night, and would not learn until about 10 days later, was that 2 other people had seen something on that same stretch of road within 48 hours of my encounter. The first was a man named Gary Tolbert, who drove a fuel delivery truck and ran that route regularly in the early morning hours. He had called the department the morning after my patrol and spoken to a deputy on the day shift who had logged it as a possible large animal sighting and filed it without flagging it to me. The second was a woman who had been driving home from her sister's house in Vanderbilt and had seen something cross the road in front of her vehicle at low speed, cross it upright, and enter the forest on the opposite side without breaking stride. She had not called us. Her sister called us on her behalf 4 days later, because the woman had not been sleeping and had stopped driving after dark entirely. I went to see her myself. She was in her early 50s, a bookkeeper who had lived in the area her whole life, and who sat across from me at her kitchen table and described what she had seen in a flat, careful voice that told me she had been rehearsing how to say it in a way that would not sound the way it sounded. She said it had been at least 7.5 feet tall. She said the arms were too long. She said when it turned its head toward her headlights for just a moment before entering the trees, the eyes caught the light and held it in a way that reminded her of a deer's eyes at night, but was not that. Was not that at all. I drove back to the office and opened my personal notebook and counted the entries. 31 incidents documented between January 3rd and February 28th. 11 of those involved direct visual contact with something that witnesses described in terms that overlapped with a consistency I could no longer dismiss as coincidence or mass suggestion. These were farmers and delivery drivers and a retired school teacher and a DNR officer with 2 decades of field experience. They did not know each other in most cases. They had not compared notes, and they were all describing variations of the same thing in the same corridor across the same 8 weeks. I went to see my supervisor, a man named Don Weaver, who had been running the department longer than I had been with it and who I trusted more than almost anyone I knew professionally. I brought my personal notebook. I sat down in his office and I laid it on his desk and I told him what I had been collecting and why I had not been putting it through official channels. He listened without interrupting, which was like him. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he asked me 2 questions. The first was whether I believed what I was telling him. The second was what I thought we should do about it. I told him I believed it. I told him I did not know what to do about it, which was why I was sitting in his office. He looked at the notebook for a moment without picking it up, and then he told me he had received a call 3 weeks earlier from a regional coordinator at the DNR who had asked, in carefully general terms, whether our department had been logging any unusual animal activity in the northeastern part of the county. Don had told him yes, some livestock incidents, probable large predator, under review. The coordinator had thanked him and said his office would look into it and that he would be in touch. He had not been in touch since. Don said he had not thought much of it at the time. He said he was thinking more of it now. We agreed that I would continue documenting and that I would copy him on everything going forward. We agreed we would not change our public-facing language until we had something concrete enough to justify it. We both understood without saying it directly that we did not have a category for what we were dealing with, and that the absence of a category was its own kind of problem in law enforcement. You cannot put out an advisory about something you cannot name. You cannot coordinate a response to something you cannot describe in terms that other agencies will take seriously. March came in hard that year, a late cold snap that dropped temperatures back below zero for nearly 2 weeks after a brief warm spell in late February that had started to soften the ground. That cold snap is what I believe kept things from escalating further than they did, at least in terms of direct encounters. The incidents dropped off sharply in the first 3 weeks of March. Russell Fitch told me the sign in the forest had diminished as well, fewer fresh tracks, no new carcasses located. He speculated they were moving, following deer deeper into the forest, as the deer responded to the cold by retreating to their wintering areas. He said he thought the corridor activity had been related to a specific prey pattern and that the pattern had shifted. He said this like a man who has convinced himself of an explanation and is aware he is doing that and is doing it anyway, because the alternative is worse. The last incident I personally responded to happened on the night of March 22nd. A family named Kirshner, who lived on a gravel road about 4 miles east of Vanderbilt, called at 2 a.m. The father, a man named Tom Kirshner, who worked construction and was not the kind of person who called the sheriff's department for small things, said something had been at the side of his house for the past hour. He said it had been making sounds at the exterior wall near his daughter's bedroom window. He said it was not an animal he recognized. His voice on the recording was level, but there was something underneath it that I recognized from 20-plus years of taking calls from people in genuine distress. That quality of a person who is controlling themselves very deliberately, because the alternative is to not be controlled. I was there in 18 minutes. I pulled into his driveway with my lights off the last quarter mile, which is not standard but felt right. The house was a single-story ranch with a detached garage and a pole barn set back about 200 feet behind it. The side of the house where the daughter's room was faced a narrow strip of yard, maybe 30 feet wide, before the tree line began. I came around the corner of the house with my flashlight low and stopped. There were marks on the siding. Long horizontal scrapes in the vinyl at roughly 6.5 to 7 feet off the ground, fresh enough that the pale interior of the siding material was still bright white against the weathered exterior color. Below the marks, the snow along the foundation had been disturbed. Not footprints exactly, more like a compression pattern, something that had been standing close to the wall for an extended period. Close enough to touch it, close enough to put its face near the glass if it had wanted to. I stood there in the dark, at the side of that house in 4-degree cold, and I looked at those marks on the siding, and I thought about the daughter sleeping in the room on the other side of that wall, and I felt something that I do not have a clean word for. Not fear exactly, or not only fear. Something more like the feeling you get when you understand the full dimensions of a situation for the first time and realize they are larger than you had been allowing yourself to believe. I walked the perimeter of the property with Tom Kirshner, who had come outside with a rifle and a flashlight and who said very little. We found where it had come out of the tree line and where it had returned. The stride in the approach was long and even and bipedal. In the return tracks, about 15 feet into the tree line, it had dropped to something closer to a 4-point pattern and accelerated, the impressions spaced further apart and deeper at the toe. Whatever it was, it had been moving slowly and deliberately on 2 legs while it was at the house. It had moved differently when it left. I told Tom Kirshner what I could tell him, which was not much. I told him to keep his exterior lights on and to call us immediately if anything returned. I told him we were aware of unusual activity in the area and were monitoring it. He looked at me in that way that people look at you when they know you are giving them the professional version of something rather than the real version, and he nodded and said he appreciated me coming out. His daughter was 11 years old. I thought about that on the drive back, and I thought about it for a long time afterward. The activity stopped almost completely after that. By early April, the ground had thawed and the deer were ranging wider, and whatever had been moving through that corridor through January and February and into March had either dispersed or retreated, or simply decided that the territory was no longer worth working. Russell Fitch told me in a phone call that spring that he had found one more kill site deep in the state forest, older, probably from late February, with evidence of multiple animals feeding. He said the tracks around that site were varied enough in size to suggest more than one individual. He said he filed his documentation with his supervisor, and that his supervisor had passed it to the regional coordinator and that he had not heard anything further. He said he was going to stop expecting to hear anything further. I understood what he meant. I kept my notebook. I still have it. 47 entries between January 3rd and March 22nd of 2010, covering an area of roughly 18 square miles in northern Otsego County. I have never submitted it through any official channel. I have shown it to 3 people in the years since, all of them retired law enforcement or wildlife professionals, all of them people I trusted completely. None of them dismissed it. None of them knew what to do with it either. I retired from the department in 2018. I moved to a smaller place on the south side of Gaylord, closer to town, with a yard that backs up to a residential street rather than a wood line. My daughter thinks I made the move because the house was more manageable after my wife passed. I have let her think that. The truth is a little more complicated. The truth is that I spent 8 years after 2010 doing my job in that county, driving those roads at night, responding to calls that took me out to the edges of that forest, and I never fully stopped being aware of what I had documented that winter. Not in a way that paralyzed me or kept me from doing my work, but in a way that changed how I moved through certain places at certain hours, in a way that made me pay attention differently than I had before. I do not know what was moving through that corridor in the winter of 2010. I have my suspicions, and I have the documentation, and I have the memories of the people I spoke to, steady people, credible people, who saw something they did not have a name for, and whose lives were quietly altered by it. What I know is that whatever it was not operating randomly. It was working a territory with what I can only describe as intention. It was aware of the people it was encountering in a way that went beyond animal instinct. And there was more than one of them. That is the part that stays with me most. Not any single encounter, not the marks on that child's bedroom wall, not the tracks in Carol Benning's yard, not the shape in my brake lights on that February night. What stays with me is the cumulative picture. 18 square miles, 8 weeks, multiple animals, coordinated in ways I still do not have a framework to fully explain. If you spend time in the northern forests of Michigan, particularly in the quieter months when the tourists are gone and the roads empty out and the tree line comes right up to the shoulder of the road in places, pay attention to what the silence tells you. Silence in the woods is not nothing. It is information. I learned that in the winter of 2010, and I have not forgotten it.